We talked about this evening has been questions and answers, but perhaps I'll give you a little something to ask about before I open it up. Originally we thought Swami Kriyananda would be here tonight, which is why we arranged for this beautiful hall. So now we have this lovely space with a smaller crowd, but it's still really lovely to be here in the quiet. It's very nice. There's a story I read in a book put out by a doctor, and he was talking about death and helping people to die, and it was a story about some experiences that people had. And this man, in the story, true story, was approaching his death, and he was exceedingly anxious. And the hospice workers and the doctors and his family were trying to help him come to peace with the inevitable, but nothing seemed to calm him down. And then suddenly, from night to morning, he became completely relaxed and at ease. And naturally, those who noticed the change asked him what was the difference. And he described to them an experience he had. And he said that he had his vision had suddenly enlarged. And whereas he'd been thinking of himself the whole time as a man lying in bed, getting ready to die, getting ready to leave the world that he was accustomed to, suddenly he realized that this whole life that he was living was just a little tiny stage set in the midst of something much bigger. I think it would be apt to say the size of this rug on this stage, and even with the curtain raised, how much space there was behind him. And as soon as that reality opened up in front of him, it wasn't only that in and of itself it was entrancing, but he remembered it so vividly that he was astonished that he had forgotten. And that was what struck him most strongly. How could he have forgotten that this little life that he was living was just a little tiny portion of this much greater reality, and that he belonged to all of it? And he said his vision shrank again, but he said he could still feel the edge. It was just a little behind him, and he would turn like that, and he could almost see it, but not quite. But of course, once realizing that, what is there to be afraid of? And everything about his life shifted. I'm reminded in this way sometimes when little children have to go off to kindergarten for the first time. And the only thing they may have known is being with their parents, being at home, and all of a sudden they don't know where they're being taken to. They don't know what kind of a world it is. And they may have tremendous anxiety about it until they get there. And then they discover, I can just expand myself into this new reality, and then they'll begin to just skip out of the parents' car and ask if they can go to school on Saturday, and whatever it might be. And all of that anxiety about expansion, when you actually experience it, proves to be nothing except an imaginary fear. Now, switching gears completely, I was talking this morning a little bit about the life of Jesus, and I've immersed myself in the New Testament quite a lot, so I have a very strong feeling for it. And there's many aspects about the life of Christ that are very moving, deeply moving. But one of the most interesting to contemplate is how little impact he made at the time that he lived. He was a rabbi among the Jews. He had a devoted following. He got the priests angry enough at him that they really wanted to get rid of him, and they engineered his execution. Toward the end of his life, he challenged his disciples greatly with comments and statements that were difficult to comprehend, so that many of them deserted him at the end because he knew what a test was coming, and he needed to have only the strong ones left who could hold each other and not be undermined by those of little faith. So when he died, he had primarily 11 strong disciples, and Mary Magdalene and his mother, a few others. And they were themselves afraid that they were about to be arrested and killed. And in fact, in the end, almost all of them were arrested and killed by the same who had killed their master. If you were going to write a recipe for a life that would just sail right through and the waters of time would close over and you would never hear of it again, that was really about the best life that you could have designed. But instead, of course, there was something completely other going on. There was, you might say, a rhythm of divinity or a tide of divinity. I often think of it like that. I think of it as a pulsing energy, that his consciousness was planted on earth, and it was planted in the hearts and minds of a few men and women, but planted with so much power that they were able then to inspire others, who inspired others, who inspired others, not merely to look to one another, but to go back to that source of energy, which was this force that simply broke through the illusion that this is the only world that there is. In the progression of Christianity, it's very interesting. The one primarily responsible for spreading Christianity and creating it is St. Paul. St. Paul actually never met Jesus. And in fact, he was a persecutor of the followers of Jesus. And he was converted by a vision. He had a vision of Jesus. And then he became so persuaded of the power and the importance of this man's message that he devoted the rest of his life to traveling around and just telling people about it. And he had so much conviction that he'd never met Jesus, they'd never met Jesus, but all of them began to tune in. And when they tuned in, they discovered that there was this vibration coming from somewhere in the cosmos that was like a wedge into the ordinary world that we're living. Now, another part, just unrelated, but it will eventually weave together. I first came to India in 1986. My husband David, two friends of ours, Durga and Vidura, whom some of you know, all of us are Americans despite, well, three of us have Indian names. But we came to America because we thought that there was a good business, a dharmic business, in bringing Americans to India and taking them to all the places that are mostly described in Yogananda's Autobiography of a Yogi. So the first trip was actually rather comical in this respect. My husband had been to India once, and then he came a second time to arrange the trip, and then all three of us came for the first time when we were officially leading others. So we would just hastily try to find something out and then turn around and act like we really knew what we were doing. We pulled it off, and it was a very successful journey, and over the next 20 years, we came back about a dozen times. Now, Paramhansa Yogananda, this master author of Autobiography of a Yogi, lived in Calcutta, but in his early 20s, he moved to Los Angeles, California, and except for 1 year when he returned, he lived his whole life in America. So there are holy places associated with his life right here in Calcutta, but most of the shrines where he lived, where his vibrations is planted, are in Los Angeles, California. So you can feel his energy there, among other places. The other masters, Jesus, of course, Babaji lives in the Himalayas, Lahiri Mahashaya, Sri Yukteswar. They never set foot in America. So I had to come, we came here, and we had the opportunity to visit places where these avatars, these great masters, had lived. Sri Yukteswar, the primary place that I've enjoyed, is in Puri, where he had his Mahasamadhi, and his body is buried in the ground, and then they built a temple. They put his body in the lotus posture, just set it in a brick-lined pit, and then they built a mandir over it. So you can go and sit and meditate, and his form is right under you. Incredible. Lahiri Mahashaya lived in the city of Varanasi, and there's a small house where he spent many, many years just sitting in the living room meditating. And nowadays you can't get into that house anymore, but when we first started coming, you could. And so we stood in the place where he interpreted the Gita and initiated people into Kriya and sat for hours in meditation. And what happened, because I think of both of the vibrations that were planted in those places and the receptivity of being on pilgrimage, is that somehow or another that whatever that column of energy is that a master puts in a place, Yogananda says that once a master puts his vibration somewhere, they are there forever. And that when something divine happens in a certain spot, then the divinity of that, because it happens in eternity, it doesn't happen in time. And so therefore it's always there. There's a very interesting story about Yogananda himself when he went to the home of one of his American disciples, Dr. Lewis. And he went to the house and he was walking up a staircase to a second floor room. This was a house in Boston, and there was a landing halfway up where the stairs turned. And Master stood on that spot and he said, "God came here." And Dr. Lewis was astonished. He had just met Yogananda and he really had barely begun to understand who he was. And Dr. Lewis said that when he was 6 years old, at that spot, he had a vision of an angel. And Yogananda's just walking up the stairs and he comes to this spot and he feels the vision of that angel. Now, partly what I'm wanting to say, and I was going to talk about, again, a little bit about these masters. This morning, some of you were present and we did a ritual that we call the Festival of Light. And part of it is doing a small arati in front of these masters. After I came to India for the first time, and the first time I had to stand and offer a light to these masters, suddenly standing in front of Lahiri Mahashaya, there was a reality to him that had never been there before. It's like somehow the physical proximity had put me into a vibration that must have always been there, but I never actually knew it. And the same with Sri Yukteswar. And then after we went to Badrinath, feeling that power of Babaji. Although Babaji had talked to me much earlier, many years ago, when I was living by myself in this very small trailer, which is my home. I had a little home in the woods, and it was this little trailer, and I had all the master's pictures up on the shelf, and my bed was right under. And in the middle of the night, for no apparent reason, Babaji just flipped off that shelf and landed right on my chest. I was just sort of like, oh, I guess I need to pay more attention to you. It was really getting our attention. Now, all of this is about just one thing, which is everybody asks and keeps asking, how do I really make my life different? And most people want a quick answer. We make our lives different by tuning into a reality that is always there, but that we have forgotten is there. And nobody can do it for us, and there's no quick fix about it. It's just a question of moment by moment, what are we going to be thinking about? What are we going to be receiving? And how much have we forgotten? And how important to us is it to remember? These masters, all the true masters, as Swami Kriyananda says, I'm not going to say that these are the greatest or the best, or the most realized, but these are infinite spirits who can touch our lives. And if you're drawn to others, it doesn't really matter who you're drawn to. It's a question of whether you actually do anything about it. And when I came to Swami Kriyananda, I met him when I was 22. I began to live in the ashram when I was 23, just before I turned 24. It's very odd when I think back on it. Later, I was put in the position of running the community that my husband and I still run. And someone came to talk to me for counseling. And I was trying to really get back into the mindset of the person I was talking to, because by that time I'd been on the path for more than 20 years, and they were just beginning. And I suddenly had this, I flashed back into my own consciousness my first 6 or 7 years. And my mind was always churning, extremely active, with all kinds of mostly non-productive thoughts that were just shooting out in all directions of confusion and desire and conflicting emotions and all these different things. So there was like one level of me that was just a complete zoo. I think of it just like a tangle of spaghetti that you can hardly pull a thread out of. And simultaneously, and I would put it from my heart, there was this absolute straight line that just was so solid, and it just knew where it was going. If you'd asked me up here if I knew where I was going, my answers would have been completely confused. But it was like I had found that beam. And what I talk about now when I think of Sri Yukteswar, it's like I almost immediately I go to that temple in Puri, his Mahasamadhi Mandir. Whenever I see his picture, simultaneously I see that temple, because that's when I found the beam of his consciousness. I mean, not all of us are able to go to those places. That was simply how it came to me. Jesus I found from reading the Bible, just reading it, just feeling that he was a real person who really lived, and that this is the story of real men and women. And wow, what an adventure. Look what happened here. But somehow or another, and I've told many of you in this week, when Swami Kriyananda walked into the room in November of 1969, and the first time I saw him, that was what connected for me. It was there was his consciousness, and there was me. I had no idea, really, what had happened to me. And it was a long time, years, before I really began to see what had happened to me. But what was so remarkable, and I pat myself on the back for this, I knew how important it was. And I committed myself to receive from him whatever I was able to receive from him, and I never looked back. I spun in crazy circles in my head, but from here, I was being compelled by the longing of my heart. Now, those of you who live in this city, this has been a week of classes. Periodically, Ananda comes back. We have activities here. It's not like every single day something else outside you is going to feed you. So the question of what happens next is entirely self-determined. That's the nature of self-realization, that nobody's going to make it happen to you. Nobody's going to threaten you with hell if you don't do it. Reading a lot about, how Catholicism used to dominate Western culture, and how the fact that you would go to hell for eternity if you didn't do these things. Teresa of Avila, who was a very great saint a disciple of Jesus and a great saint, not an in-person disciple or not in that life, although Jesus came to her all the time in living form. But when she was a tiny child, she set off to be martyred. She ran away from home, hoping to find the Moors, as they called it then, because the Catholics and the Moors were always at war. She was hoping to go find the Moors somewhere and have herself beheaded. And she was extremely keen on doing this, because the teaching that she had been raised in said this life is just a moment, and if you can be martyred for God, you'll have all eternity in heaven. So she thought, why waste all that time growing up? I'll just go do it right now. And to her mind, it made great sense, and she was quite distressed when her father found her and brought her back home, because she was determined that she was just going to skip the whole middle part. Now, unfortunately, really, it's not that easy. We could go ahead and be martyred, but that's no guarantee. There's no death. Where Swami Kriyananda has often said, nothing happens when you die. Just nothing happens. We think this big thing happens, but nothing happens. We just walk off this little carpet over to here. And we think it's a really big experience when we're standing on the carpet because we can't see beyond the edge. But when we actually just step off the carpet, well, there we are. I was talking to a friend earlier today about just the challenges of life and the changes in consciousness that they can bring. And this life goes by so quickly. I'm 65 years old, and I hear that I've been on the path for 40 years because I've been introduced night after night. And so I've just been hearing over and over that I've been on the path for 40 years, and I think, wow, that sounds like a big number. Doesn't that sound like a big number? When I was 22 and I started this, if somebody had told me that there would be 40 years later, it sounds like such a big number, but trust me, it's nothing. Because here we are. We're just right here. But it's a big number for this reason. There were a lot of days, there were a lot of moments, there were a lot of temptations to give up and just settle for less. Now, let me be honest about myself. No, I never really was seriously tempted to give up. But there were days when I didn't think it was going very well. Let's put it like that. That, success was not guaranteed. But once you've seen on the edge of the carpet, once the dying man knows that I'm not really dying, I'm just going over there. And I came from over there and came here, and when I came from there to here, I promised to remember where I came from. But we get so interested. We get so extremely interested, and we get so staked out in my career, my home, my family, my children. And then we get staked out in, you owe me, and I've done all this for you, and why haven't you done this for me? And I need this, and I have to have that. I mean, it's just like, we're all the same. But the question is whether there's anything underneath that, pulling us, just pulling us, and whether we're listening. And don't worry, don't sweat the small stuff, is really how I think about it. Everybody's life has huge disappointments in it. But that's what moves us forward. If we didn't suffer in this world, we'd just hunker down and enjoy ourselves, and then what would we have? Well, we think it's something, but it isn't really all that much. It's the power of these masters. And what we have to build, I really do think the secret of success on the spiritual path is the relationship. It can't just be an intellectual idea. You can't have a family life in which you're just working with the idea of having a family life. You have to actually build relationships with your children and with your spouse and with your in-laws, and you have to actually expand your heart into something other than just your own little story here. The most amazing thing you see about the spiritual path, and the amazing thing about these masters, is that they're living. There's a very dear story told about this disciple of Yogananda's. Swami Kriyananda was his name. He didn't know Yogananda in the body. He came after Yogananda's Mahasamadhi, but he was deeply devoted to him. There's two stories that are very good. There was a period of time when the daughter of the President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, when he was president, his daughter Maureen had an interest in yoga, which was a really big deal to all of us who are interested in yoga in America. And apparently she came one day to the Self-Realization Temple in Los Angeles where Brother Turiyananda was giving the service. And I guess she just couldn't resist. So afterwards, when she was shaking hands, she said, I am Maureen Reagan, and my father is President of the United States. He said, oh, I'm so pleased to meet you. I'm Brother Turiyananda. My father is Lord of the Universe. And then on another occasion, this same marvelous man, Turiyananda, someone was saying, well, I'm drawn to be a disciple of Yogananda, but I need a living guru. And Turiyananda just looked at him in a most, puzzled manner. He said, Yogananda is alive, sir. It's you who are dead. Just like that. But there's truth in that. Really deep truth in that. That relationship has to be based on some open-hearted commitment on our part, just like all relationships are. And on this particular path, there's 5 masters that you can choose from, and then there's also Swami Kriyananda, who has become such an advanced disciple that his consciousness will take you right into the consciousness of these masters. Each of them has a slightly different vibration, but it doesn't really matter where you tune in or to whom you tune in, as long as you begin to understand. This is what I try to express to people when I'm teaching a beginning meditation class. What we're doing when we're meditating, it's a relationship that we're building. And it's not just, sometimes people think of meditation as just some kind of a swirling inner reality here, or else they think it's like entering some imaginary state. Now I imagine there's a field of flowers and I'm walking through the field of flowers and the sunlight is on my head and I come to a waterfall. And these are very relaxing images, but it's a pleasant fantasy that may be a better fantasy than the fantasy of this life that we're thinking about all the time, but it's still just something we make up. Whereas when we meditate truly in the right way, which is what Kriya teaches you, and you can learn in many different ways how to do Kriya, raising the energy in the chakras, focusing the energy at the spiritual eye. But above all, and Kriya is not just a technique that exists in a vacuum, it's related to these masters, and it's part of our saying, I know that I need to be guided by one who knows the way. And so, as important to any other aspect of Kriya practice, is that we have to have a relationship with the master. Whoever that master may be to us, of these masters, or Yogananda, whoever it is, Swami Kriyananda, we have to participate in we have to enter into that column of divine awareness that's coming into us. And when we're meditating, we have to really appreciate that we're not alone. We think of it as a solitary practice. It's the most unsolitary practice there is. We have separated ourselves from our ego, and in that sense it's more solitary, but we separate ourselves from our ego in order to be in a vibration where the consciousness of the masters is always there. It's just always there. And once we build that relationship, that just becomes like the underlying soundtrack of absolutely everything that you do in your life. And it's something you always have access to. We've been working, as some of you know, on a movie about Ananda, which will be out in another half a year. And they're working now on the soundtrack for a movie. And if you go to movies and you've had anything to do with making one, you begin to notice all sorts of things. The musical soundtrack of a film, it should add to the whole experience, but you shouldn't necessarily be pulled off to hear the soundtrack all the time. But your whole experience of watching the movie is often actually formed by the music. Filmmakers say that a movie can be, made or lost by the music. If the music is good enough, it can make up for everything else. And even if everything else is good and the music is wrong, the audience might not know why, but it won't work. And I began to realize that pull to the spirit, which nobody can make you want. It's like you either want it or you don't. You can cultivate that desire inside yourself, and that's what I'm talking about right now. So that the soundtrack of your life is always this thought of this relationship, of how God is helping me, Divine Mother is helping me, Master is helping me, Swamiji is helping me. And we're always together in this. I've referred many times to my husband, David. I've been married for 30 years. There's a kind of comfortable companionship if your familial relationships are harmonious. There's a kind of comfortable companionship that just becomes an aspect of your life. This is the longest I have been away from him. And it's been very interesting to me just to watch on a human scale sort of where and how those vibrations are exchanged, and how much of it is just completely integrated into my being. We've lived together for such a long time that there's a harmony of spirit that is not interrupted by physical separation, but is nicely renewed by a Skype call. You know, where when there's not that much said, but there you are, we're just looking at each other. But as above, so below, what we do and understand in a human way, that's what we're really trying to do in a divine way. We need to keep the company of the Master at all times. Let the soundtrack, the musical soundtrack of our life, just be that companionship. And if you don't feel it spontaneously, then cultivate it. Just as you would a human relationship. Someone is sitting next to you, and you know there's not that much warmth between you. So you start a conversation. You find out who they are. You find out what they're interested in. You find out how you can serve them. And then after a time you find that a pleasant harmony builds between you. That's what it is to live in the company of God, and that's what it is to be a disciple. And once we activate that relationship within us, then because it's real, it begins to start pulling us. And even when we wander away a little bit, we begin to come back to it. Thinking over all the years that I've been on the spiritual path, and let me say it like it actually really is. I've worked very hard, I think mostly in previous lifetimes, to be really honest about it, to really understand where true fulfillment is going to come from. And that is the constant battle, because you see, we only do that which we think is going to make us happy. Everybody does. And it doesn't mean you can't also do human things or have to discard all possibility of enjoying this world. Swami Kriyananda sets us an example of a very natural spirit. When I first came to Ananda, to the ashram there, just before I was 23, it was actually that very summer. I was a food fanatic, actually is the word for it. I was a food fanatic, and I was very strict about many things, including the fact that I never ate any white sugar. This was, fad of my time. I never ate any white sugar. It had been like 3 or 4 years since I'd had any white sugar. To say that I was a little rigid and a little proud would be putting it very mildly. But very early in that cycle, there was a woman who'd had an accident. We all went to town, to the hospital to see her. And then afterwards, Swamiji took us to what was then Swenson's ice cream parlor. There were about a dozen of us. He took us to Swenson's ice cream parlor. We sat at a long table at which Swami was at the head of the table, and as it happened, I was at the foot of the table, and there was 5 or 6 other people on either side. Led by a very exuberant Swami Kriyananda, everybody ordered not just ice cream, but banana splits and things like that. Everyone but me. I ordered a glass of water, please, no ice. And I sat at the head of the table, and I'm sure Swami was acting it out just for my benefit. He was not only eating his huge portion of ice cream, he was tasting everyone else's, and everybody was enjoying themselves so immensely. And I was sitting there like a raisin, sipping my water like this. Fortunately, it occurred to me that it was I who was out of step and not them. That there was just something wrong with this picture, that in my isolation and my setting up of all these rules for myself and the pride that came with that and the self-contained idea I had about what it meant to be spiritual, that somehow I was not in the bubble of joy that everyone else was enjoying. I mean, ice cream or not doesn't make any difference. It wasn't the issue. But it was this wholehearted realization that wherever you go, God is. And that's the example of life that both Master and Swami Kriyananda have given us. They were so engaged. Swamiji tells us in the path about when Master was a young man and He used to lecture. When he came to America, he was in his mid-20s. I mean, think of all that power and youth. And he lectured in the largest halls in America. 5,000 people would come and see him. And the way Swami described it, he would run out onto the stage, and his long hair would be behind him, and he would have his robes, and they would sort of flap in the movement of his energy, and he would say to everyone, "How feels everyone?" This is in America, this Hindu man in the 1930s. I mean, this was long before what we're seeing now. "How feels everyone?" And then he would train them all to say, "Awake and ready." And then he would say, "How is everyone?" And he would make them all say, "Awake and ready." And there was no necessity to hold himself at a distance. He just gave his whole heart to everything he was doing. The only way you can give your whole heart to anything like that is if you have no fear. And the only way you can have no fear is if you realize that it's me and God everywhere. As long as we have it all divided up into all these pieces, sugar, not sugar, poverty, not sugar, not poverty, just this and that and this, and what about me, and what if people don't give me what I like, and so on like that. No, but when we just live in the company of these masters, how would you behave in this setting, sir? What would you do? How would you love these people? How can I be your instrument? It's just so, really, in the end, completely boring to be ourselves. We just get to know ourselves so well, and we're so predictable. It's just really tiresome. But when we're in that ray, you just never know what's going to happen, because God is always using you in some way. Whether or not that's the life you live is really so much up to you, up to me, to just realize this is who I really want to be, and let me every single day just pray and try to be that way. And you will find yourself 40 years later saying, my, where did the time go? It just went moment by moment. And it went through some hard things where the joy level wasn't so great. I remember when we were going through a really difficult period, when I've referred to the litigation that we were involved in for a long time. We had to go through a court trial, which was just a absolute mockery of justice. It was just really quite interesting. And I said to David in the middle of that, it's a good thing that I've had other years besides this one, because if this were my only year on the spiritual path, it might have been my last year on the spiritual path. But it goes up and it goes down. And whether we just sail through it or get crashed on the rocks and then have to pick ourselves up and start over in another incarnation depends on the strength of that inner relationship. Just like a marriage. Whether it lasts or not depends on all those days and what you've actually put into it in every single day. Whether your friendships last or not, whether your relationships with your parents or your children, every single day. Just train yourself. First thing when you wake up, good morning, Master. What are we going to do today? I have my bedroom at home set up in such a way that as soon as I open my eyes, whichever way I'm facing, I see one of the masters first thing. And I've just gotten really into the habit of saying, good morning, here we are again. Then you follow your sadhana and you do all the things that you do, but just out of your heart, good morning, here we are again. When you see a beautiful sunset, oh, hello, God, there you are, smiling at me. Hello, God, hello, Guru. If you live that way, just like a simple child, then you find that a power comes into you that you didn't even know was there. And you're amazed that you forgot. How could I have forgotten this? All of us are tested, but the more deeply we've sunk our roots on a daily basis before those tests come, the more powerfully we can ride through them, and the more total our transformation will be. You see Swami Kriyananda, some of you have. He just can't even talk about his guru anymore without just tears of joy and gratitude coming from his eyes. Just before Swami Kriyananda decided to move to India, he was living in Italy. This was 2003, and he finished writing the book Conversations with Master. When Swami Kriyananda was a young monk, his guru told him, write down what I say. And he always knew he was going to have to write about Master. And he took notes in a stack of notebooks. And Swamiji described how all the years, because 3.5 years after Kriyananda came to Yogananda, Yogananda left the planet. Swami Kriyananda wasn't even 25 years old before his guru was gone. And he had those notebooks, and he said he protected them like a loving father would protect a sickly child, he said, for all the years of his life. And he began to write The Essence of Self-Realization, The New Path, and then finally he wrote Conversations with Yogananda. And when that was done, he'd finished the notebooks. It was finally, that assignment was finally done. So he's calling from Italy, and he was saying, I've finished my work. And he was in very ill health, and he kept talking about that he thought he would just die. He just didn't see any reason not to. And he felt like the life force was ebbing out of his body. I mean, he was very weak on the phone, and it was fine. And I said to him, well, sir, it would be unspeakably selfish of us, of me, to even for a moment to say, if you're ready to leave the body, please don't leave the body. He's given us so much, he has a right to take his reward if that's what he wants to do. But then I said to him, but sir, your presence on this planet is pretty much what makes it bearable. I said, if you're not on this planet anymore, it's not going to be nearly as much fun as it is now. And very, very seriously, he said to me, I know, I've been through it. He said like that. And I thought to myself, he was 25 when his guru left the body. And so all the years since then, he's had to make the relationship just deep in his heart. Now, even though he's done that beautifully, there was still that little bit of a nostalgia and for those of you who heard him last week, when he just talked about what Master was like. Just what joy, what fun, what charm, what creativity, what constant, ever-new surprises he brought. But once that is drawn into your own heart, then it's also always there. Swamiji even said once, very interestingly, he said, in many ways, those of you who never knew Yogananda when he was in the body have an advantage. He said, because I knew him, especially when he was alive, he said it was so confusing. Because I knew he was the infinite spirit. I knew he was God realized. I knew he was as much in my own consciousness as he was anywhere in the universe, but he was also in the next room having dinner. And he said, sometimes it was just impossible to reconcile the two realities. And Master just very sympathetically would say, oh, if you only knew my consciousness. But there is a truth to that. There's both of it. The example of the Master's life, the vibration of their specific realities, and then just that ever uplifting possibility of their presence within us. None of this does justice to what I'm trying to say, but I hope it intrigues you enough that you'll conduct the right experiment. Because that's everything. If you yourself try to make friends with God and Guru, you'll find yourself in a very short time in a highly desirable place that you didn't even know was there, which is this sense of ever-renewing happiness coming out of your own heart. And that's really what the essence of the spiritual path is. So I think that's all I have to say of that type. And what I would do at this point is take questions if you have any, and see if we can make it more what you want. Yes, sir.
Madam, this is not a question. I have registered my name for all the discourses you have given.
I'm sorry, sir. Could you please start over? There's a little bit of an echo. Speak slowly so I can understand your English. Go ahead. Say. Could you please repeat what you said again? A little more slowly. Uh-huh.
I had registered my name for all the discourses,
Uh-huh.
but yesterday evening I could not attend.
Uh-huh.
Could you please repeat the salary features?
The
Yesterday evening's discourses.
I didn't
He
quite.
could not. Okay.
He attended all the discourses except last night, and he
Right.
would like to know the salient features of last night's discourse.
Last night. Okay, first I have to remember it. It was health and vitality.
Yeah.
I will give you a very brief summary since most of the people in the room were there. Let me tell you, first of all, the reason that the cameraman is here is because everything is recorded, and it will, within a week or so, appear on a website, and you can simply listen to it again. If you look up my name, Nayaswami Asha, you'll be led to a website. That website will lead you to recordings, and it's free, and you can just, if you have access to the internet, you can watch it or listen to it again. The salient points of last night were about energy. And the energy, I essentially described that life is a question of the quality of your energy, the quantity of your energy, and which way you direct it. And those three elements together determine our magnetism. And our magnetism determines our fate, because everything in the universe is a relationship of energy to energy. In the context of what I'm talking about tonight, I'm really talking about directing our energy from the heart and from the spiritual eye into a conscious relationship with the self-realized masters who govern this world. And that is how to have the most and the best energy and magnetism. Beyond that, I'm honestly, I don't think it would be fair to the others to repeat the lecture. And secondly, I'm incapable of doing it, fortunately, because when I speak, I just speak to the audience that's there in the moment. And after it's over, it's gone. I remember those points because I put them on the board. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be able to remember them. Honestly, think about it. If you talked as much as I did and remembered everything you said, it's a recipe for absolute lunacy. The only thing that saves me is that it happens in the moment and then goes out of my head. So that's as far as I can oblige you. Just before you leave, make sure you understand how to find it on the internet. That's the best thing I can offer. Okay? Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes, sir.
Very, very wonderful talk from you.
I'm glad you enjoyed, sir.
I'd like you to sum up whatever you said this evening so that we can carry something to our home.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The question is to sum up what I just said, remembering what I just said. Well, I'll sum it up from this point of view. Before I came out here, I was meditating in the back, and because it was just a wide open thought, and I was reflecting on the fact that many of us, in different combinations, have been meeting together all week. This has been a really, I want to say, a really wonderful experience for me. I've really enjoyed just being with everyone day after day and sort of building on each other's topics. And I really tried to think when we separate tonight, I'm going to Delhi and everybody else goes back to their home and this whole cycle is over, so what happens next? But I thought, the Master is always with us. I mean, I'm constantly introduced in relation to Swami Kriyananda. I should be introduced in relation to Swami Kriyananda. My whole life has been defined by him. It's just as simple as that. Nowadays, with the self-evident spiritual stature that he has, I actually thought the next time I come, we have to make sure there's a picture of Swami on the stage. But so I started thinking about how did that happen? I mean, it was very, very, very good karma on my part. There was no question about it that I happened to meet him so early in my life. But I also participated in that. When I saw what he had to offer me, I absolutely made it my first priority. Nothing, absolutely nothing was more important to me. And nothing has ever been more important to me than that. It's that there's a source of guidance and happiness for us. When I found the spiritual path at all, the path of self-realization, which I was actually introduced through the writings of Swami Vivekananda. But this is what it did for me. Prior to that time, life was a completely random experience. There was no center point to it. And many things would happen, but it was like just a rock randomly rolling down the hill. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't know what was moving it, and it was just a terrible feeling to just not know which way was forward. When I read Vivekananda, I discovered that there was a point of reference. That point of reference was God realization. And absolutely everything that happened could be understood in relationship to that point. So that became an intellectual idea to me. And for the next 3.5 years, I absorbed it intellectually. Then I tried to absorb it from my heart. So I started reading books about saints. And there was a very good bookstore near us, East West Bookshop, which now Ananda runs. But I would go in there and I'd go to the lives of the saints. And I'd just read them. Because I wanted to know how people took this intellectual idea and actually turned it into a way of life that wasn't just ordinary. But none of them were living. They were Catholics, they were yogis, they were Milarepa, up in Tibet. I mean, they weren't living in San Francisco and working on Montgomery Street, which is where I was at that time. They weren't my life. They weren't now. But when I saw Swami Kriyananda, I saw, in a certain sense, I want to say an ordinary man, although he was extraordinary, clearly, but he was also ordinary. He was just a man. He was standing there. He spoke English without an accent. And yet, I could see that he had converted his consciousness into this truth that God realization was the center of everything and everything orbited around that. And there is a divine law of Sanatana Dharma, which is the grace of God is passed to us by those who have contact with God. This is the need for the guru. And people say, well, why do I have to have a guru? Do I need a guru? Well, Sanatana Dharma tells us we need a guru because we need to have the consciousness focused in a God-realized master, and then through that the power is given to us. And Swami Kriyananda never claimed to be God-realized. But it was quite clear to me that he was much closer to the infinite than I was. And by aligning my life, and above all my inner self, in a way that is hard to put into words because it's very subtle. Even though I had lots of contact with him, he didn't tell me what to do. He never told anyone what to do. That was the oddest thing. He simply lived. He just lived and did what he thought he should do, and the magnetism of it just drew you right in behind him. So he never had to tell you. You were just drawn into the wake like the boat going down the river. And that relationship, which for 25 years or more, I haven't lived in the same community that he's lived in. For many years, I haven't lived on the same continent that he's been on. Increasingly, he doesn't really communicate through the telephone or through email or anything. He's just more and more remote. But not really. It's just right in your heart. And it's not dissimilar to the way I feel my husband, only the human relationship is a tiny imitation. But your vibrations match. And when your vibrations match, you're always in harmony with each other. There's no time, there's no space, there's no distance, there's no life or death. And I thought if there's just some way I could encourage people, because we've been talking about so many other things, how to get along with your spouse and how to have good health and so on. But all of it comes down to aligning your vibration with a God-realized master, whoever calls you. And if you don't know who you truly belong to, then find a master that you can believe in and ask him to help you. I was guided for a long time by Sri Ramakrishna. I never took any vows or any initiations, but he had a hold of me. And I was very aware of the fact that he was taking care of me. I was guided by St. Francis of Assisi, and they all sort of kind of softened me up a little so that by the time I got to Kriyananda, I was ready, right? But if you don't really make that heart-to-heart connection, it'll all be interesting to you, but you won't really find yourself somewhere else later, and that's where you really want to be. I had a delightful experience. There was this couple from New York. My first job at Ananda village in the ashram was cooking in the kitchen for the retreat, which was also where most of the residents lived. So, and they didn't have kitchens. So for about 30 people on a regular basis, 6 days a week, I cooked for them 3 meals a day. And on the 7th day, I went to town and bought supplies, so I was very busy. And people would come in and help me wash dishes. And in that very first year, this couple from New York came, and they were there for about 3 weeks, and they washed a lot of dishes. We spent a lot of time in the kitchen together. 6 or 7 years later, Swami Kriyananda went to New York City, and I went with him. And we actually stayed in that apartment. And the name Asha, Swami Kriyananda gave me. So when they knew me, I had a different name. So when I came, I was now Asha. He introduced me. I said, I know you, we work together in the kitchen. They said, we've never met before. I said, no, we work together in the kitchen. Oh, I remember that woman in the kitchen. They said, that wasn't you. The third time I tried to say that I knew them, then I thought, God is giving you a gift here, don't deny it. What they're saying to you is that you're not that person anymore. You've become somebody else. And I finally said, yes, I must be mistaken. Perhaps you're right. That's what Sri Yukteswar says. Perhaps you're right. But I always thought, isn't that wonderful? To become unrecognizable in such a short period of time? Isn't that a joy? But that doesn't come from the mind, that comes from the heart. And it doesn't come from self-effort. It comes from grace. The self-effort being only to make the relationship so that the master can get in there and change you. That's how Swami Kriyananda talked about it. Yogananda said to him, I know every single thought that you think. And Swamiji said that Master demonstrated many times that it was true. And then people would say, wasn't that disconcerting to you or embarrassing? And Swamiji said, no. He said, I wanted him to know everything that was going on within me so that he could change me. And that's what we have to cultivate. We have to want God and Guru to know every single thing that's going on within us so that he can change us. That's why we're here, is to remember that this edge, which is just what I call myself, it's just an edge, just step off it and become someone else, why not? And have people say, oh no, I don't know you, I've never met you before. You're right, Is that fair? Yeah. Yes.
Mine too is not a question,
Uh-huh.
it's also another confirmation. You were saying that if you make the right effort,
Yeah.
like if I continue putting this effort on this spiritual path, I can hope to get this grace of God and Guru. Like I tend to become a little skeptical, so that's why I'm just
Sure.
confirming. So I can at least have that hope to get the grace of God and Guru.
Skepticism and doubt is a particular cross to bear, because part of you wants to go forward with faith and another part of you says, oh, you're being taken advantage of. In the essence of the Bhagavad Gita, the commentary that Swami wrote, he has a few paragraphs about doubt. He says, he confirms that it is an extremely difficult karma to deal with, because the very part of you that wants to go forward is also being undermined by that fault. I mean, if you're lazy or have an addiction to bad habits and so on, in some ways those are easier to deal with because the doubt just keeps twisting your efforts. His advice is, in a certain sense, disappointing because all he says, there's simply no choice but to persevere, because the only thing that will actually ease your doubt is experience. You can't satisfy it intellectually because the mind is poisoned and it goes in circles. But when you have experience, an experience of peace, an experience of God's grace of any kind, an experience of being rescued, of being loved and protected, I would encourage you to read the book I just wrote, seriously, because it's all kinds of people and all their stories, and there's a certain undeniability about the presence of God in there. And this is what I would do. I have to say this because it has not been my karma in this life. So I'm going to make suggestions based on what I've seen has helped other people. Every single time something positive happens to you, write it down. You know, no matter how small it is, write it down. Keep a journal, and you know, don't crowd the journal. Like, make every page one event. You know, I was feeling lost and alone today, and then suddenly this warmth came into my house, and a sparrow landed on the bush outside, and I watched it for a moment, and I felt uplifted. I really thought I didn't have enough money to pay the rent, and then suddenly somebody paid me back money that I never thought I would get back. I was driving down the highway today, and I almost had a collision, but at the last second I moved. Whatever it might be, write down every time that God comes through for you, and then read it often. So when the thought crosses your mind that this time it's not going to happen, you can turn the pages and say, well, it's happened every other time. Why would it not happen now? And I would also get for yourself some affirmation that you can genuinely believe in. Just something that's not too big, such as, you know, I will make a sincere and dedicated effort to open my heart and mind to the presence of the Spirit. So all you've promised to do is to make a sincere effort to open yourself. You haven't declared, God is always with me and protects me in all circumstances, because if you're plagued by doubt, your doubt's going to say, oh yeah, come on. So you want to make an affirmation that you really can believe, but nonetheless it's going to lift you higher. And then I would pray, even if you don't believe it when you pray it, you know, Lord, you see the pickle that I'm in here, and you need to touch me strongly and often enough to get me out of this. And then you just have to make a commitment. What will you gain by quitting? What will you gain by letting your skepticism draw you away? You know what that is. You're living in it. So, in a certain sense, what have you got to lose by trying? Because you can always go back to the nothing. But at least now you have a slight possibility of going forward. Make success really tiny. You know, so that if you're just a little more focused and a little more comfortable today, don't try to go all the way to the end. Just take very tiny steps that you can actually stand on. Here's another slight way to think about it, and I don't know you well enough to know if this will help you, but I'll offer it in case it will. Sister Gyanamata was the most advanced female disciple of Yogananda. And she gave this advice, and now I can't quite remember the context, but it doesn't matter. There's a book of letters called God Alone. It's really one of the finest spiritual books ever written. If you haven't read it, it's an exquisite book. It's letters that she wrote of advice, letters that Yogananda wrote to her, letters that she wrote to Yogananda. But she says, you have to base your spiritual life on whatever actual experience you really have. And she says you need to keep backing it up until you're standing somewhere that you can actually really believe. You know, and maybe the best that you can believe is people who seem truthful have told me that these practices will work. And because I believe that they're telling me the truth, I'm going to try these practices. And maybe you can't say to yourself that I actually believe these practices will work, but people that I like who seem truthful have told me that they'll work, so I'm going to experiment and see if they've told me the truth. Or you can say, I know that sometimes I feel that I'm not alone in this world and that there's a loving presence. So I believe that there's sometimes that God is there. And maybe you can stand here and say that no, everything in this world I know is a manifestation of the divine and nothing happens outside of God's will. But don't try to say that unless you really believe it. And no matter how far back you have to go, just stand somewhere that you can really believe, because you can't get there except from here. That's what I've talked about a lot of different times. We have an apple tree in our backyard. It's a big apple tree. It gives us lots of apples in the right season, and it must have grown from a seed, because that's how trees grow. I know they actually graft trees together now, but nonetheless, let's say it grew from a seed. But it didn't get to be an apple tree from a seed. First it became a sprout, then it became a little green shoot, then it became a stick, then it became a sapling. It had to go through every single stage. So if you're a person with a lot of doubts, then find whatever piece of any of it. And maybe it's just rhythmic breathing calms me down. And so I believe in even rhythmic breathing. And then we do even rhythmic breathing whenever we can, because we know it works. And then sometimes Kriya actually works. And sometimes chanting actually works. But I can always scurry all the way back to I know that even rhythmic breathing works. And then you have sort of a bottom under you. But if you try to stand here and it's just all rocky, then the slightest thing's just going to throw you over. So don't make that your base. Just go out there when you feel strong and then scurry back. And slowly by slowly, as you say in this country, slowly by slowly, I love that expression, you'll actually find that it will change. And you won't even know, it's like an ice cube melting. Just suddenly you'll look over and where it was isn't. And you don't exactly know when it went away. And then you'll think, oh, I used to be skeptical about these things. I wonder why. Okay, I hope that helps. It's a tough one. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes. Uh-huh.
I have a guru.
Uh-huh.
I'm doing something called pranic healing.
Uh-huh.
And our guru is Grandmaster Chokuksui.
Okay.
But then he himself had suggested us to read Autobiography of a Yogi.
Right, because this is...
I also feel very inspired when
Uh-huh.
I read his teachings, and I have been attending your classes, and whatever I get to hear about the Ananda, so everything is so appealing and nice, but then he too is my guru, Chokuksui,
Right.
doing pranic healing and erratic yoga. So is it okay, because this is a little confusing for me,
Right.
to attend different spiritual
Right.
classes, because it's also helping me.
Mm-hmm.
I won't say that is not good or this is not good, but all of them are good, and this is inspirational as well as that is inspirational. And this is also helping me. So is it okay? Because usually we all talk of one guru.
I know we talk of one guru, right.
But is it okay?
Well,
this is my question.
the question is, and I'll repeat it just because most of it probably came out on the recorder, but not all. He's inspired, and he follows a guru who teaches him certain healing methods, but he's also, even that teacher recommended, that guru recommended Autobiography of a Yogi, and now he finds inspiration here. There's multiple answers to this question. The word guru is used in lots of different ways. If he's your guru for this kind of healing method, that doesn't necessarily mean, and I have no idea about the man you're talking about, and it's actually not relevant. You don't have to explain him to me. But a Satguru who is a fully self-realized master who will take you to God realization is not the same as a guru who's expanding your consciousness and teaching you something here. His own level of consciousness, even the point of the relationship, might not be the same as the relationship would be with, for example, Paramhansa Yogananda. He would have one intention in his relationship with you, which would be to bring you to enlightenment, to liberation, to nirvikalpa samadhi. Whereas this other man that you are calling guru, and might well be your guru, for these particular practices, Yogananda, in a sense, would come in over that. Okay? Now, it's possible, because someone else had also asked me this similar question, and my own life actually followed a pattern like this. You can be devoted to a path. You can even be devoted to it for a long time. Well, let me back it up a little. When I met Swami Kriyananda, I was completely captivated by him, but at that time especially, he would not take the role, he didn't take disciples himself. We were all disciples of Yogananda, and he radically downplayed his own importance. As the years have passed, he's been more willing to be more open. I perceived him in a certain way from the first moment, and it's been exactly the same. But he's played his role in the world shifting. Now he doesn't mask his energy anymore. But the point was, I was attracted to Kriyananda, but in order to really be on this path, I needed to be attracted to Yogananda. And I wasn't particularly. I hadn't even read Autobiography of a Yogi. I hadn't wanted to read it. I didn't like it. After I met Kriyananda, I found the Autobiography of a Yogi fabulous, but prior to meeting him, I couldn't relate to it. I felt very devoted to Ramakrishna. I felt like he was guiding me. So I had this dilemma. Kriyananda is clearly where I should be. I need to relate to Yogananda in order to relate to Kriyananda, to have Kriya initiation, all the different things that I wanted to have. But my heart belonged to Ramakrishna, and he had been taking care of me for so long. How could I suddenly turn my back on him? It was really, those were big issues. This is what I decided. I require deeper intuition to be able to see the truth of this. My intuition is simply not developed enough for me to understand how all these subtle realities come together. So, lacking intuition, do I just sit here and just sort of hope that somehow I'll figure it out? And I thought, if I don't do something to expand my intuition, I will never understand this. So I felt that I would just go with what was self-evident to me. Now, you've described that the Ananda teachings inspire you, Autobiography of a Yogi inspires you, you're learning things that you want to know. Maybe you just don't have to worry about how it all fits together. And what I decided was I would just do what Swami Kriyananda told me to do. I would act as if I had complete understanding and faith, because if I did that, my consciousness would expand. And when my consciousness expanded, my intuition would develop, and then I would know what to do. But if I did nothing because I was anxious about the conflict and this, then I would never grow. And I would just live in a state of conflict forever. And because I believed, which was self-evident, that Ramakrishna, Yogananda, Swami Kriyananda, it's all true. I'm not talking about false teachers. These are all true masters. They're certainly not going to compete for me. They're just going to take care of me. So if I just go where the only thing I can see is there, then my own experience will open doors for me. So I took the whole thing. This is what I literally said. I sat in front of the picture of Ramakrishna, picture of Yogananda, the picture of Swami. I said, you guys, it's your problem. I really said, I'm not going to think about this again. I'm just going to do what's in front of me with my whole heart. And after it was like about a year or a year and a half, I just woke up one morning and I could see that Ramakrishna had guided me and brought me to Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda had brought me to Yogananda. They'd all brought me to Ananda. And there was just no problem here. But if I had not dove in, I'd still be standing on the sidewalk in San Francisco trying to sort it out, right? So a tremendous amount of the spiritual path is developing confidence in your own experience and not being afraid to follow it. Not having this fearful attitude that God will punish you for sincerely doing the best that you can do. Even if the sincere best that we do is pathetic, and hopelessly misguided. If it was our sincere best, then guys, you're just going to have to sort this out. And you can be very friendly that way. So if you're benefiting from what you're learning from the man who's helping you, keep going. If you're benefiting from what you're learning here, don't be afraid. Just come here. And if it's all true and it all expands your consciousness, it'll sort itself out. It'll just sort itself out. And in the meantime, what do you have to lose? You'll just grow and grow and grow and learn teachings and learn truth, and all of it'll just sort itself out. And yes, it's true, at a certain point we concentrate, at a certain point we need to take in one vibration, but you have to be absolutely sincere. Merely because someone says here, you have to make a choice, you have to say, not yet, because it's not true for me yet. I'm not ready to make a choice. I'm just going to keep on until I know from my heart what I'm supposed to do. Trust that. Yeah, certainly. Yes.
Ma'am, I'd like to ask that how can you overcome the negative human emotions, and how can you help others to overcome them?
How can we overcome negative human emotions and
Hatredness, selfishness,
yeah.
fear, jealousy.
How can we overcome negative human emotions and help others to overcome them? It takes time. And you lose a lot of battles before you start winning. I think the biggest thing it takes is the courage not to become discouraged by our failures, but to just recognize that, Swamiji often puts it this way, I haven't yet succeeded. That's how he says. I think of it this way. This is my game for that sort of thing. The number of errors that I'm going to make has to be finite, because delusion is finite. Perfection is infinite. So eventually I will escape from finitude and I will enter infinity. And one of the ways I will escape is that I will finish the karma of being drawn into Maya instead of being drawn to God. So even if it's 100 million times that I'm going to make this mistake, it's still a finite number. And every time I make the mistake, it's one less. That's how I look at it. So that has been very helpful to me in terms of keeping up my courage to not be discouraged. Now, just a second, I have another thought there that's eluding me. I don't want to lose it. Oh, I know what it is. This is it. The other thing that is a very, very helpful distinction to make in your understanding of, let's say, negative emotions. I'm answering your question a little from the back. We can also answer it from the front. The back is, let's say you're going to fail. Let me just I'll talk in a minute about how to succeed. But I draw a very strong distinction in my heart between those things, those actions that I commit, and those actions and attitudes that I am committed to, okay? Because I may commit an act of selfishness, I may commit an attitude of jealousy, but I'm not committed to those actions. When they happen, I recognize them for the errors that they are, and I make a resolution to go forward from that point and try not to do it again. Now, astonishingly, just that little shift of energy is an enormously important part of overcoming these attitudes, because it happens, it's a burst of karma that you can't control, and it comes out of you, but if you immediately don't disidentify with it, whoops, there it is again. And then you just back up and say, well, these things happen, but I'm not committed to being that person anymore, I'm committed to being this one. Now, the other way that we change is not by trying to concentrate on pushing these things away, but by adding into our life more and more sweetness. Just the happier we are inside, the less inclined we are to do those things. We do those things for one reason. We're suffering, and somebody does something and it makes us suffer more, and then we just think if we spread the suffering around, we'll get better. So just go at it from a completely different angle. Do those things that bring true divine happiness into your life. Kriya Yoga meditation, prayer, chanting, uplifting music, everything that lifts your energy. Just talk to that gentleman in the back. That's what I talked about last night too. Just do everything that lifts your energy. And if you're happy, and if you're happy genuinely from the inside, then you just find that those things go away. I have a theory which is just completely what I call the gospel according to Asha, which means I just made it up. Nobody else said it. I don't think we ever actually get any better. I think that just sort of the blot of our confused ego just kind of stays there. We somehow think that divine perfection comes because we straighten it out, we get rid of this thing and we get rid of that thing and we get rid of this thing and we get rid of that. But what we're doing when we do that is we're just so self-absorbed that we just live in this little tiny reality in the name of fixing it by trying to straighten it up. I actually think that we just forget about it. And it just becomes kind of a little lump under the carpet and we just go over here and live happy. And then every so often it does something really unpleasant. But then you just turn your back on it as soon as possible. Now, that's not really true, but it's not entirely untrue either. Self-forgetfulness. Just self-forgetfulness. That's the spiritual path. It's not perfecting this ego. It's just forgetting about it. Who cares what it does? I was talking to someone earlier about someone that we both know who's a highly evolved spiritual being, but has personality characteristics, some of which are a little tough to deal with. I have personality characteristics that are sometimes really tough to deal with. I have a lot of energy, and when it's off, wow, it's really impressive, you know? But that's just the way it is. I don't want to become so self-absorbed that all I'm thinking about is, oh, if I could just get rid of this quality and that quality, just take the whole concept of self and throw it away. That's really the best way to get rid of it. And then all the other things I was saying, the more completely you live in the company of God, the more you begin to see everything in that light, and you're just not inclined to respond in the same way. Transformation is a mystery, and it's not really the self-focus that we think it is. It's actually just putting our attention elsewhere. I hope that helps. Yes, next to you.
Can you explain something about intuition and how to use it?
Intuition and how to use it. Yeah, Swamiji describes intuition as perfect, as calm feeling. What blocks our intuition is that the likes and dislikes of the heart. We divide the world up into what we want and what we don't want. And because we're always allowing our preferences, reason follows feeling. This is a divine law. Swami Kriyananda is and always has been since I met him, the most intelligent man I have ever met. He's widely read, he's highly educated, but he has just this extraordinary intelligence where he can perceive and see solutions and put situations together and understand people. I mean, it's made it just totally fun to have him on this planet because he's just fascinating. Just as he talked about Master, how interesting Master is as a person, as a personality, Swami's just been fabulous, and I have a lot more to write about him for that reason. But one day I really began to ask myself, what is the secret of his intelligence? Because it's of a quality that's entirely different than any other intelligent person that I know. And he's elderly now, and his body has begun to shrink a little, but when he was younger, he had a very strong physical body. Not from exercises, but just from energization. And he had a characteristic posture that his spine was always a little arched like this and his chest was a little out. It wasn't because he was heavy, just the way he was. In the Mahabharata, when they talk about Arjuna and his bow, it actually is representing meditation. The taut string is the spine and the curved bow is the upraised heart, the upraised chest. And when Arjuna gets depressed and unstrings his bow, it means that he slumps and he breaks his posture. And Swami Kriyananda would always walk in such a way that the first force that would cross the plane would be his heart. People who have strong minds tend to try to push at life with their brain like that. You know, I see myself a lot of times, I'm trying to push at life from my brain. Swamiji always met life with his heart. And reason follows feeling. The likes and dislikes of the heart are what confuse us. I realized that the secret of his intelligence was in his heart. And it was because he was absolutely fearless about perceiving and accepting truth. He didn't want his preferences. He didn't want his comfort. He didn't want his likes and dislikes. He only wanted what was true and what was God's will. And with that calmness and clarity and lack of confusion, the brain was just brilliant because nothing shadowed it. And I watched myself and have watched myself, how amazingly, if I don't want to know something, I don't know it, or how confused I get. And how my feelings, my emotions will mask as intuition because I'll have this really strong inner push towards something, but it's just my desire, and I can tell because the opposite scares me. And I came into a period once where I was having a very hard time understanding God's will, which is the same as intuition. And it was very simple. I finally realized, I don't want to know. That's all. I really don't want to know. I only want certain options. And they're not the divine options. And so whenever I feel that I have trouble with intuition, now, I always say, what am I afraid of? Just ask a very different question. What am I afraid of? And you know, if you ask that sincerely, you'll be told. And if you systematically work through your fears, you find that your intuition is then automatic. All right? I think that we have fulfilled our responsibilities this evening and offered, it looks Debjit has one more. Uh-huh.
Yeah, a question. See, when you are in the community, it feels so great, you know. When you are with people with Jamalji and others, it's calm. You can also feel the vibrations around in this room, for example.
Yeah.
Come Monday, you go to your office.
Yeah, I know.
Escalations, client escalation, delivery, people shooting each other on emails.
Yeah.
And you are back to your off track. How do you really control this? You can't even meditate in the room because we are either in the open or in the glass cabins. So how do you control this 1 week before you come back to?
That's why you have to keep the guru with you at all times, because if you are alone, you're sunk. It's really pretty much solidly. If you go back to your office by yourself, you're in big trouble. So you have to just, in every possible way, you have to take the master with you. A very successful business friend of mine used to always have a chair in his office that was placed in such a way that it was a little inconvenient for anyone to sit in, so it was always empty. And in his mind, Jesus sat in that chair. And it was very real in his office. Jesus was always in that chair, and often when he would be in difficult situations, he'd glance over to that chair. He just had it in his mind that Jesus was in that chair. Another friend of mine who couldn't put any, symbols of her spiritual devotion in the room, she had a picture of Master sort of in the back of her center drawer. And whenever she would start a meeting, she would always pull out her drawer and she would keep her pen way back there, and she would pull her pen out like this, or keep it in your shirt pocket, and make a habit of just touching your shirt pocket. What you need is God reminding realities in the midst of that. You need a mantra or an affirmation. You need symbols of God in your life, and you have to begin to believe that it's possible to bring that consciousness in there. Is it easy? No, of course not. Is it worth doing? Well, for heaven's sakes, yes. Because what is the alternative? And yes, we have these moments. We all have these moments where everything comes together. I used to bring these pilgrimages over to India. We'd be for 28 days. We just go around in air-conditioned coaches from one holy spot to another with all these people in beautiful hotels, and nobody had any responsibilities. And at the end of it, there was a dual reality we'd face. Absolute panic that it was over, and the joy of having had that experience. But this is how I said it to people, and this is the truth. Whenever you touch into the power of the divine, that never leaves you. It may leave the immediate awareness of your mind, but just like Master on the stairs there knew that an angel had come to Dr. Lewis, every time you touch into the divine, and actually let me tell you the story in this way. Swami Kriyananda was giving a satsang in the living room of his house in the early 70s, at the time when the whole community could fit into that one room, so it was really early. It was an extremely deep evening. There was just some magical spiritual energy in that room, very profound. Swami himself was in a very elevated state of consciousness, and he sort of looked out over all of us, and he said, when God realization comes, he said, the moments in which you touched into spirit, he said, you look back over all your incarnations and you see them. And he said, and everything else is gone because everything else was a dream. And the only true thing that happened to you was those moments when you touched into the spirit. And I felt in that moment he was saying, which was true, that evening had been such a moment. And over the course of years of dedicated effort, you string a lot of those moments together. And in between you have the wire and all the rest of the stuff the comfort is that those will fade away. But the moment that you've actually touched into the spirit is like a little radioactive grain. That's how I think of it. It's planted in your heart. And if you actually plant a radioactive something in your system, it would be a bad idea to do so, because it would gradually sort of mutate everything around it, right? But in a positive way, that's exactly what happens. Don't think that merely because circumstances have changed, karma has reasserted itself, the delightful interlude is over, that you've actually gone back to where you were before. That's not true at all. It's deeply buried in you, and it'll work its way out. You may not realize it, but it will. And that's another act of faith that's built up over a period of time. And you can actively go back to it. I was speaking of the times I have sat meditating where his body is buried. I can go back there. It's not as powerful as when I was sitting there. It's not as powerful when I was with 30 people and we were chanting for 2 hours. But I can still go back there because it's in me. And it's more real than anything else. It's eternal within me. And every time you touch into the spirit, you are permanently shifted. But then you have to do all the in-between to make that your constant reality. And yes, it's difficult, but an easy life is not necessarily a victorious one. Make that relationship with God, figure out all the ways that you're going to bring him in with you, and then make a game of it. It gets to be lots of fun to see how it works. Certainly. I think that's all for this evening. Thank you all very much. It was a joy to be with you.